My name is Mike Lucas. I am the Curator of Historical Archaeology here at the New York State Museum. And we've got a nice program today. We're talking about black farming, black farmers in the capital region and throughout, I guess, throughout New York as well. So I'm going to give the first presentation. And what I want to talk about is so I want to talk about farm ownership, but I want to focus on loss, and the loss, in particular, the loss of Homeplace, because and homesteads, because you can own farmland and not be invested in that land as someplace as a home, as something that you pass down from generation to generation. So, a little bit of historical background. Um, So in the 19 teens, at the sort of apex of African American farmland ownership, black farmers owned about 15 million acres in the U.S. And that, if you look at the numbers of farmers in the South, that was about almost a million farmers in the South and about 12,000 farmers in the northern states. In New York, um, right around that time, there was around 300 African American farmers and farming about 22,000 acres or so. One of the big differences there is farm ownership. So if you look at in the teens, black farmers in New York owned about 65%. 65% of the farmers owned their own land versus places like Georgia and Mississippi, which farm ownership was a lot less. And in the 12 to 15 to 20% range. Then if we advance to today, this farm ownership has decreased by about 64%, and this figure actually comes from around, I think, 2002, so it's probably much higher at this point. So in terms of farmland ownership loss amongst the African American community, that's what we're looking at. In New York, the farm ownership is less than 5% of, or I mean, less than a half a percent of all the farmers in New York are African American. And then at the bottom here, I have a figure that's important for understanding what's happening today. Bill Gates is the largest farmland owner in the country. And so there's a lot of wealthy families that have this type of acreage ownership, and without any connection to farming really at all. So what it's done is really driven up prices. So when I was coming up, farmland, I grew up in Nebraska on a farm, and farmland was going for about $800 in the 1980s, and now that same farmland is about 10,000. So there's been a sea change in terms of what farming has meant just in the last few decades. So, and then we can look at discrimination in terms of farm ownership and the access to capital and loans and so on. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights released a study on equal opportunity in farm programs in 1965, and one of the things that they found was a lot of small farms were declining, but for African Americans it was at a much higher rate than for white families. The other thing you see here that's telling is just the number of acres owned, because you need more acres to leverage to get larger and larger. And that's what's really happened in farming in the 20th century with mechanized farming. You really have to have larger farms. So part of that that's going to work against you in terms of keeping those farms. And then, of course, that translates to a much smaller income from farming as well. But then this discrimination continues in the 20th century, not so many years ago, in the 80s and early 90s. And there was a civil lawsuit against the USDA and things like the localized system of ASCS offices around the country for systemic discrimination, and that led to the largest civil rights settlement in U.S. history, called Pigford versus Glickman. And to date, I think around 20,000 African American farmers have benefited from this lawsuit in terms of the discrimination that occurred just recently. So if you look at land ownership, one of the ways that in New York, certainly, this is Garrett Smith here on the left. He was a wealthy, large landowner in New York, and he granted a lot of his land, and a lot of people know about this during the 1840s, to African American farmers. And part of the reason for doing this was in 1821. So if you go back to the history of how people voted, really it was, if you go back in the 17th and 18th centuries, you had to be landed to vote. But then when you get into the 19th century in New York in 1821, they did away with that land ownership except for people of color who were required to own $250 worth of land. So Garrett Smith, and in conjunction with Stephen Myers and other freedom people working toward with freedom seekers, tried to set up a system where farmers could get onto land and actually have the opportunity to vote and then become empowered in that way. Unfortunately, the most famous one is Timbuktu up in the Adirondacks, but the land was poor. So a lot of farmers didn't take advantage of those grants just because it's an isolated area and the land was poor. So this is one way that people think about land ownership, but I want to really talk about individuals outside of these larger efforts to rectify this problem, and how did they actually acquire farmland? So the one area I want to talk about is what was Watervliet in the 19th century, which is now Colony, Menands, that area, up here to the top of the screen. And if you look at Watervliet, the African American population there, right around the turn of the century, is about 10%, or just under 10%. And so these are the farmers. These are the farmers in Watervliet, and they were enslaved African Americans. And so if you look at that, you take that, okay, we got 10% of the population. Then by the end of gradual emancipation in 1827, that population has dropped to 3%, but there's still a community there, and a rural community. So, you go from 10% of people who are really doing the work on the farmland to a smaller percentage because they went other places, and afterwards there were other opportunities. So when we looked at this area, all of Watervliet, there was one area where there's really only one area where African Americans were able to purchase land, and this was right around a place called Bach Corners, related to the Dutch Reformed Church that was there at Bach Corners, and there was a little community of older Dutch families that lived in that area. So there were 5 farmers that we were able to identify as purchasing land. So some of the questions we had were, how were they able to purchase land? How did they confront discrimination, marginalization? How are they able to maintain their farms through time? And then, of course, what can archaeology contribute to our understanding of this process, and really this idea of making a place, and how can we trace that through time? And then, of course, in the end, how can we maybe preserve these farmsteads? So if you look at land acquisition, usually the way that these farmers at least four of the five farmers, they purchased their land from former enslavers. In most cases, from their former enslavers. And the one exception to that is Prince Jackson. You see at the top here, and he was able to acquire land from the Shaker community for labor. So he got a certain number of shillings per day, and then he was able to get 2 acres of land after serving that. So there were at five families that were able to purchase land outright. The Dutch Reformed Church was a big part of this. All the families were part of the church. Well, except for Prince Jackson, I'm not sure if he was actually a member of the church, but the Thompson family and the Powell family, they were all members of the church. And of course, they were probably going to the church, whether they liked it or not, when they were enslaved. You see the inside of this church here. This is, I think, down at Poughkeepsie, and so African Americans would have been on the top balcony, even in the early 20th century. And then this is the Bot Corners Church as it looks today. So if we compare some of the farm values, if you look at farms that are valued at less than $1,000 and farms that are over $1,000, you see a big difference. So if you look at black ownership versus white ownership, and for under $1,000, the average is about 4 acres, and the price or the value per acre is around the same. But it's when you get to these farms that are valued at over $1,000, the average acreage is only still 4.5 acres. But you can see the difference here. And the only family that really reaches that threshold is the Powell family that I'm going to talk about in a minute. White ownership, white-owned farms are $600 per acre versus the Powell family with the farm was worth about $100 per acre. So that just shows you the value of the land that they actually have access to. So I want to talk about the Powell family. And I would invite you to go out and look at the exhibit that we've set up, The Power of Homestead, that talks about the history of the family in detail. So I'm going to go over some of those things that we talk about in the exhibit. And so the Powells, we know a lot about the Powell family from basically standard government records, the census record. The church records are great because we can trace first and last names and marriages, and so we can figure out who, the different families and their relationships and so on. So we know that Thomas and Betty Powell were enslaved by the Fawn and Lansing families in these areas here. You can see the early Dutch Reformed Church there. And so these are the two families, the Fawn and Lansings. So Thomas and Betty were living in these two households close by. Two of the children of the Lansings and Fondas were married. Those two houses joined. And then, so Thomas and Betty were in the same household. And then in 1808, Thomas and Betty were married in the Dutch Reformed Church at Bot. The Powells had, their family was never very large. It was Thomas and Betty. They had two children, Paul and Jane. Jane never married. Paul married Hannah Elizabeth Kilbourne, and they had two children, and Jenny and Thomas D. Powell, and neither of them were married. So it was a fairly small family. This aerial that you see here, this is the 1952 aerial, and you can see the Powell household there, the house at the top. These are the properties that they purchased. The first ones in the first couple of years, they were so they were probably freed by both of them probably by 1815. And so by 1818, they had purchased a 5-acre parcel, and then they added another one. So they had 7 acres by 1820. And then they were able to purchase this little property here in 1843 because you can kind of see that arc of the arc, this is a railroad that came through this railroad line. So they had to take this part of the Powell property, but they were paid for it. And so they were able to parlay that into piece of land here. And that's really what the Powells understood, the importance of land. So they were preserving their resources to buy more land, and they just kept doing this because they saw this was a home place, right? So they saw that, if they add more land, they can continue this into the future. So they were always really looking toward the future. In 1850, they buy a larger parcel of land, and this is really the first time that you see them actually getting some decent land, because this land right in here is really poor. You can't really farm this at all. There's a little bit up in here you could farm, but there's actually some flat land over here. You can not only have livestock, but also you could farm. So this was really kind of a game changer for the Powell family, and they paid about $1,100 for this parcel. So they're saving their resources through time to try to purchase more land and really build the home place. If you look at the farm values here again, this is when they had 40 acres. You can see the Powells here on the left. It's still the value per acre is very very low compared to the other farms of roughly the same size. And then if you look at here, you can tell it's kind of reflected in their output. So acres plowed, but then you can see the oats per acre, fairly small, potatoes and corn. These blue lines here are people who were able to afford fertilizer, which the Powells were not. So, so this really just kind of reflects that the land is really not very, very good land. They got what they could get. So, if we go to archaeology, what can we actually learn from the site itself? And this kind of mirrors what was their fortunes throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. So you can really use the archaeology as an idea for that. This is what it looks like today. It's overgrown. In part, that helped preserve the site because it was hidden from view and people weren't out looting it and so on. So we went in there and did some testing. And just to make sure, we wanted to present to the town, and we wanted to prove that, first of all, this was the Powell site, and then that there was something left of the archaeology, and that it's important to preserve. This whole project is to try to show the importance of the Powell site, but in the end, try to preserve this in the public record, so it's a place that exists in the future. So this is the first little foundation that we found, and this was the you can see on the right-hand side here the 16 by 16 foot structure. That was the original house, and we know this, or we're pretty sure about this, because of the types of artifacts we found. So all the early artifacts are like in this area over here, and this house might have looked something like this. This is a house on Long Island. It's about the same size. We know that it had a chimney on the gable end, just like this. So it's probably something like this, wooden structure with a stone foundation. And then, this is just a telling artifact. This is one. The type of resources that the Powells had access to early on. These are very poor fired brick. You can see here, it almost looks like a loaf of bread. So they were getting what they could. They were getting the resources. They might have got these bricks for free, or they paid, maybe less for the resources. And they were pooling what they had for the land. And this is just another example. Oops. So a lot of changes happened in the 1840s and between 1840 and 1865. I told you about the large purchase of land, but then also the family starts to expand. As I mentioned, Paul marries Hannah Elizabeth Kilbourne. They have the first child, Thomas D., and then Jenny a couple years later. And then one of the big changes too is Hannah moves over to the Powell residence when they get married, so she's over there by 1860. And then in 1865, it lists the rest of sort of the extended family from Troy. So she was from Troy, and so the household expands a lot. And this is important not just for the people that move over there have some means as well. So they're sort of pooling their resources. But there's also a lot of people living there. So if you look at the 1865 census, it lists 2 structures. So we wondered how that relates to archaeology, and we think we figured that out. So you can see this right here. This is a hearth that we found. So you remember the early house is right here. So then there's another hearth over here, and like, okay, what's going on with that? So by the archaeology and the artifacts we found, we can tell that this right here is probably an exterior wall. So there wasn't. This is an add-on at some point. We can't really tell what's going on with the cellar here. It's just archaeologically, it's kind of ambiguous. But what we think happened was they had two buildings. They had to build another structure over here, and it maybe was, a small building just like the first one. And so if it's a gable end chimney, it would have been on this side, and maybe there was a door out here with a shared sort of courtyard. And we found in the archaeology, we found this line of stones, which we're sure is a fence because um, and you're going to see this in any rural setting. You have a yard this is really clean. It's you can see the soil's only about 3 inches deep, and there's very few artifacts in it. The artifacts that are in here are very late, so it was probably a swept yard, but it was kept clean. And then the trash was thrown on the other side of the fence, and this is pretty classic in rural areas. You throw the get the garbage out of the yard area and over the fence. So we found that through archaeology. And then, as I mentioned, there was an addition on the back side here. That's what we think it looked like at that time with this central yard area. These are some of the artifacts that really date to all the different time periods. There's individual like sewing things. We had lots of buttons and all kinds of stuff like that. There's also medicine bottles, but the probably most interesting artifact is this right here. It's got the initials HEK for Hannah Elizabeth Kilbourne. And usually I don't find an artifact that has somebody's name on it that's related to the site. So this is a really interesting personal object. And then taking us to the 1880s, you can see here the value of per acre for the Powell farm has really gone up. So what's going on with that? Um, if you look at the bushels per acre, it's still the Powells are pretty far down. I mean, it's not like the land has really improved at all. So it's about what you would expect. They're not producing any butter anymore, but what they are doing is they're going sort of all in on milking. So they realize an opportunity to really go into the milking business. And so Paul Powell, he's in his 60s at this point. Thomas, the grandson, Thomas D. Powell, is around 15, I think, in 1880. And so they're looking toward the future. They're building this milking business, and you can see they're one of the largest milk producers in the area. And then so they have to, in order to, one of the things that they add at this time is a cellar, probably related to the milking business, and you can kind of see this line where they've added the cellar on to the structure here. And so if you look through if you look at the sequence of how this thing developed, you've got a garden over here. We actually found some a garden midden. So the first house looks like that with a yard. They build the second house, and then you see these midden. That's just an area of debris, yard debris. That's all that means. So they were throwing, food remains and stuff out in the garden. And then the end of it looks about like this. So it was a fairly large building at the end of the 19th century. What happens, just as a coda here, so in 1884, Paul Powell dies, and so prematurely. And so his son, Thomas, wasn't able to really take over the farm at that point. So they tried to rent out the farm, which they were so successful, at least in one case. But they got behind in taxes. They had to sell one of the properties that they had. So they were in sort of financial peril there for a while in the late 19th, early 20th century. But one of their extended family relations from Troy, the Hegeman family, came in and paid the taxes in the early 20th century, and the Powells are still living there. They tried to start up the farm again when Thomas got old enough, and then Thomas um, dies in his 40s early, and neither Thomas nor Jane had any children, or I mean Jenny had any children. But the person who bought it, Jane Hegeman, the Hegeman family moved to Detroit, Michigan. So they were there for 30 years and they still own this property. So it was the importance of the property as a home place itself. So they had it for 30 years while they were living in Michigan. Um, and as a side note, Grace Hegeman, who was the owner of the property, or Grace Edwards, her married name, she was the first African American woman to retire from the Detroit Police Department in 1948. And then when she dies in 58, they sell the property. So at this point, we're trying to preserve the land in public trust. And these are some of the organizations that we're starting to work with to see how we can preserve it. And that's really the most important thing, to have it available for the future. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.